This series, Sophistic Lingchi, implying the death of 1,000 cuts to sophistry, is designed to put to bed the incessant, contradiction-laden, and boorishly populist assertions of internet chuckleheads who claim to be authorities on art and philosophy. Having a webcam, a Netflix subscription, and a knack for regurgitating generalities doesn't mean you know jack shit about how to articulate a point. The purpose of this essay is to find out if objectivity, that is, the grounding of experience in an agreed-upon provable truth not subject to the bias of an individual's experience of it, gives us the ability to determine the qualities of an artwork and thus its value. However, the following passage frames up the reason behind my decision to begin a series of critical video essays concerned with art, art theory, and the history of art history and its philosophies. A personal note. The advent of internet technologies over the last few decades, between the mid-1990s and what will soon be the 2020s, has spurred on a fast and ever-growing pool of creative content, increasing in volume seemingly exponentially. Production companies appear to continuously top themselves with peak efficiency, churning out ever-newer content into a market for art, movies, writing, gallery works, music, games of all stripes, you name it. This is in addition to millions upon millions of works generated from non-industry creators being shared all across the internet. As is well known, as long as there is art, there will also be critique and analysis of it. An art form in its own right, and yea, verily, there is no shortage of fantastic long-form critical insight within online communities. I can point to various channels who are setting the bar high for art, and who have a knack for consistently uncovering the standards for and by which we should judge works both contemporary and bygone. Creators like Collative Learning, Red Letter Media, Mauler, Your Movie Sucks, Ahoy, Rags, Lindsay Ellis, Nerd City, Colossal is Crazy, and George Rockhall Schmidt, to name the very smallest sliver of the online critique community. There are many, many more. I highly recommend looking at these channels and poking around their affiliated and related channels as well, if only to get your noggin jogging just a little bit. All the creators I've just mentioned have some key features in common that make their content stand out amidst the crowd. They're consistent in their philosophy of critique. They understand how to address complex questions and situations that might arise from an artwork using conventional language, and all utilize objectivity to find the value of art. But like anyone who dares to level heavy scrutiny against an idea, many of them suffer the endless burden of dealing with detractors who use mindless subjective reasoning to dismiss their views as pretentious and meddlesome, and oftentimes outright refuse to accept the validity of their criticisms, most egregiously by invoking the fallacy of the subjective nature of art. I find this viewpoint disheartening, and ultimately detrimental to art, culture, and even society. Quite frankly, I'm tired and outright annoyed at the predatory essence, laziness, moralism, sophistry, and politics of subjective criticism, be it game reviews, movie vlogs, or whatever the fuck other cultural product. Critique from a subjective standpoint is not meritless, but when taken alone, hinges the value of art on popularity, smacks of monetizing the egoistic, self-serving tendencies in human beings, and drives art to its lowest common denominator by attempting to convince people that thoughtless, drooling spectacle is tantamount to a greatly defined punctuation of high effect. That means I think they fucking suck, and I want people to wake up to that notion through the discovery of more thoughtful alternatives. I aim to contribute by finding standard for art, or at least standards within art. This requires objective analysis. To finally answer the question of, can art be objectively qualified in terms of good or bad? The first step is to find out if objectivity can even be applied to art in the first place. Some critics of art support a philosophy in which art must always be viewed subjectively, because to them, each person's experience is their own, nuanced in such a way that no one else can also experience it, that each person's experience is unique. This viewpoint puts each observer of art at the center and sum of their experiences, perceived or otherwise influenced by, and so necessarily excludes them from objectively assessing the experiences for others. At the crux of this argument is a solipsist-leaning worldview, not unlike Levi-Strauss's idea that all semiotics are mythological in nature, because an individual's subjectivity taints the language before its transaction can be complete. It supports the idea that communication is inherently flawed, because translation must always occur between parties, and so can never accurately transfer an idea or experience, necessarily eliminating the need for standards. This is the "we can never really know someone else" conclusion. Unfortunately for these critics, the island universe is an outmoded philosophy that probably didn't foresee the tech boom of the new millennium that would eventually become a world lexicon. the internet, a complex library that is constantly aggregating thoughts, ideas, hard data, and other modes of expression which help us to further formulate standards for objective reality. A topic for another essay, maybe. I find it pretty funny that we know that objectivity has a place in human concerns since it's the basis of almost all scientific discovery and for much of the academic world at large. Yet critics of art may still maintain that somehow art is not an institution in which objectivity can be or perhaps should be applied. I'm here to say that it can and it should be. We'll have to determine first that we can in fact concretely communicate an idea with one another. This is not actually that difficult, since as human beings we have not one, but at least three fundamental faculties which allow us to form a base objective reality: observation, recognition, and memory. Sense organs translate stimuli to our brains. Our brains may both retain and recall the experience of that stimuli. Testing recalled experience in various patterns without directly corresponding stimuli is called imagination. For example, getting burned on a stovetop, recoiling from a hot fire because your brain reminds you of the pain from being burned, and lying in bed thinking of ways to prevent yourself from being burned again are all part of building an objective reality. Cause, reaction, remembrance, critical thinking, imagination, and comparison help us to build an individual or personal model of objective reality. The exchanges that occur between the body and the world that exists both inside and outside of it are the fundament of translation, which is to say language, and are inherent to each individual. This internal language also chiefly comes to be how we imagine the experiences of others, testing of which may range from complex medical and scientific experimentation to the broadly termed empathy. To say it bluntly, there are conditions for describing the experience of existence that are irreducible. Even emotional states can be determined objectively. These and other states of existence may be subjectively felt, uniquely experienced, but their occurrence is measurable by using semantics. Sadness is a broad term. A person can be sad. But if we further describe the emotion using simple language, such as the feeling of the idea of loss, we give it a more concrete meaning. The terms can be refined but not reduced. Separating such an experience into base, universally defined terms is ultimately how we form the building blocks for objective communication. At the core of this practice is to reduce each statement into elements that can be proven to be true, discarding superfluous and unnecessary elements that might cause contradiction or falseness. An objective language will always attempt to use true statements to maintain a universally applied reality. Philosopher Donald Davidson's book, Subjective, Intersubjective, Objective, does a really efficient job of describing the dynamics of interpersonal knowledge and supports my statements thus far. Yet even better in the argument for the objectification of art is his 1967 essay, Truth and Meaning, in which he argues that any true language must be statable in a finite form, regardless of potential expressions, and that these statements must meet truth conditions in order to contain value. In other words, semantics gives us a platform of communication that is both manifestly observable and concretely true. Scrutiny is necessarily objective, thus universal, regardless of any potential subjective permutations. I recommend at the very least checking out Truth and Meaning. It demonstrates more clearly how we can conclude that language and true interpersonal communication are possible, but only through the lens of objective reality. So we can communicate objectively using semantics, but can we do so about art? We'll need to lay out a foundation of what art is in order to determine that. A hotly contested topic, I'm sure, but it's not impossible to find an agreeable solution. Since so many different things have been counted as art throughout history, what we need are the base conditions on which something can be considered art. And to find that out, we need to start with how artwork is generated. Experience, as it relates to existence, is necessarily tied to aesthetics, the brain's interpretation of stimuli and the environment on your body. The etymology clarifies this. Aesthetics are necessarily tied to art. Experience is recognition and categorization of the change in stimuli in relation to the perceived self through the translation of aesthetic properties through the senses. It's necessarily physical. Art, by design, manipulates an experience using aesthetics in order to produce an outcome. This outcome can be as strictly or loosely defined as an artist decides, but its existence, the outcomes, is paramount to determining what is and is not art. Art, at its foundation, must be an experience shaped to purpose through aesthetics. Another way of saying this is that art is the purposeful affectation of experience through the design and implementation of aesthetics. And although art can be made for and shared with the self alone, if part of the goal of a work is that it's to be shared with others, then communication must also play a role in the artwork. Not only do we find the baseline for objective analysis of art in this sentiment, but also solve the problem of the possibility for other forms of life to create art. Bowerbirds greatly illustrate this, as does Binny the Bunny, an abstract painter that also happens to be a rabbit. Art is an experience shaped to purpose through aesthetics. What does this mean? It means that an artwork is conditional to the circumstances of the artist's existence, is produced for and of the senses to the observer, and has an intended goal determined by the artist, even if that goal is simply to just produce something. This means that all three faculties necessary to construct a base objective reality are also needed to create and understand art. Other strictures can be attributed to the realization of an artwork that may not necessarily apply to the overall argument here, but are commonly recognized traits of art itself. An example is that art is imaginative, or that it is emotive. For the purpose of determining the objectivity of art, we need only its base mode of operation, and so while not rejecting other contestations of the definition of art, of which there are many, we'll be dealing with only the initial assertion, since semantically it encapsulates all known art. Insofar as the conditions that make universal truth and language possible also exist in the experience of art, it can be said that art is not just a form of communication, but that we can use language to describe art. Thus far, we have a basis for objective reality, objective language, a definition for art, and a way to objectify it. But what about value? Can that be objectively determined? If communication necessarily binds us to objectivity through the shared portions of an experience, whether edified by predetermined rules, such as those found in language, logically transitive, as found in the experience of cause and effect, or ephemerally existential, in that the experience of the work is the work itself, then we can finally say that there may be a basis on which we can build objective categorizations of art. Communication gives us the tools to define the object of art just as it would an object of a mathematical equation. So it's in this way that we can also begin to determine the objective qualities of an artwork through any combination of the following: finding its intended purpose, looking at the efficiency of our delivery to the experience of the artwork, using recognition and memory to compare the experience of the artwork to other experiences like it, and attempting to imagine or realize more effective and affective means of producing the purpose of the experience. It helps to know that often the work's purpose is inherent in the observation of it, as art is the language through which the artist communicates, and the observer or interactor are causally related through experience of the artwork. If we can find the base objective qualities of a work of art, then we can build a database for those qualities and thus determine a standard for the experience of the work. These standards do not need to be represented through subjective conceptions of good and bad or better and worse. Instead, the objective, undeniable qualities of the work must be observed and proven. Then, and only then, can we exhume the criteria for determining what is good or bad about a work of art. For example, a painter wants to make and display an abstract painting on stretched canvas that is mostly red in color. We have here all the criteria we need to evaluate the finished piece, if those are the only criteria the artist is using. We know that the work must be visible to anyone who can see, that it must be qualified as a painting, that it must be available to be viewed, and it must reflect a larger percentage of red light to an observer's eye than any other color. We have the purpose of the artwork, the medium of the artwork, and we have the necessary qualities the art must possess. We'll come back to this example in a moment. The complexity and count of a work's qualities are inconsequential in determining the ability to objectively critique it. What matters is the purpose of its existence as it relates to its affectations on its audience. I think herein lies the heart of the solipsist subjectivist view of art. The uniqueness and bias of the observer's existence will always cause them to experience the art subjectively. That's always true. However, and I want to stress this next part, just because subjective bias of an artwork must be applied to experience it, that does not exclude us from identifying the art objectively, finding its qualities, categorizing them, and identifying which objective qualities fit the frame of the work's purpose. Separating out the qualities of a work that operate in favor of its purpose from those which are either superfluous, unnecessary to, or contrary to it, will then give us an objective standard for critiquing the value of the work. The results must then objectively qualify the function of the artwork, exactly the same as how truth conditions operate in objective communication. There is absolutely no argument about the subjective nature of experiencing art which can dispute that existence precludes and is inextricably bound to objectivity. In fact, the laws of physics refute that notion outright. Experience is both categorically subjective and objective. Shared experience is predicated on developing terms and conditions equally recognizable between individuals, a complex semantic language built on truth. In the physical sense, a work of art is translated through aesthetics. It exists in the objectifiable world. Let's go back to our example of the red painting. The only missing component in the example is the artwork. Once we have it generated and presented, the critique can be finalized. How was the work generated? How many parameters of the intended purpose did it resolve? Let's say in one scenario, the painting fulfilled all the qualifications of the artist's intent. Its final form was paint on stretched canvas, 75% viewable red surface, and it was placed in an easy-to-see and well-trafficked location, such as a downtown storefront window. In another scenario, the painting is on a loose, unstretched canvas. It's 30% red, 40% blue, and 30% some other various colors. It hangs on the artist's studio wall, mostly out of the public view. In the first scenario, the painting is 100% effective in achieving its intended purpose. In the second example, it is not. That means the first example is objectively more valuable as far as the artist's intent is concerned. Now, I realize the downright simplicity of the example, but as more complicated stipulations and circumstances arise, more and more critical thinking can be applied. Of course, the cross-examination of similar works with the work being critiqued will uncover even more evidence to determine value. Unintended circumstances, convolution of the ideation, and the fallibility of both the artist and the observer certainly muddy the water. Nevertheless, the irreducible conditions of an artwork can be scrutinized with semantics, so at the very least, yeah, it's possible to objectively critique art, regardless of the ambiguity and permutation of its expressions. So the next time you hear an art critic, movie vlogger, game reviewer, or even an artist use the fallacy that haters gonna hate, and that their favorite art is off limits to your critique because it's like your opinion, man, you can stare that fucker right back in the face and say, that's not how art works.